this small island and look at his big neighbours. Probably not be wrong to think it looks like this. What if I told you the island actually looks like this? And what if I told you this island was the 4th richest country in GDP per capita in the world? The small island's name is Singapore, but how did it get like this? It all started in the early 1800s when the British East India Company was trading with China for tea in exchange for opium. After China banned opium in their country, Britain declared war, and Britain won Hong Kong after the war and forced China to start trading opium again. So they wanted a port in the strait between India and China. All the land in the strait was controlled by the Dutch, but Britain didn't really care and just done it anyway, and gained the port after an agreement with the Dutch, as it was seen as worthless because of the lack of raw materials on the island. The port was different from the other Dutch ports in the region. It had no tax at all, and that any ship docked. Because of its lack of taxes and loose regulations, it quickly grew and its economy boomed. Tens of thousands of traders from all over Asia came to Singapore. Ships filled the coast of Singapore. The economy boomed even more when the Suez Canal opened in Egypt and removed thousands of miles from the sail from Europe to Asia, increasing the trade in Singapore. Demand increased because of the opening of the Suez Canal because it decreased costs from trading from Europe to Singapore. Singapore continued to grow until 1942. Then World War II had been going on for 3 years, and Japan got into conflict with the Western Allies due to its expansion. Singapore wasn't safe. It was occupied in 1942 and wasn't liberated until 1945, but by then the damage had been done and Singapore was basically a pile of rubble. Living conditions there severely declined after the war. After Britain failed to protect it in World War II, Singapore gradually turned towards independence and joined Malaya in independence in 1963. Didn't last long, however, and the Nationalist Party took control of Malaya and was more power to the native Malayans and not the Singaporeans and other groups in Malaya. The Malayan government thought Singapore would destabilise the country, and they were kicked out of the Federation in 1965 and left to fend for themselves. A dictator called Lee Kuan rose to power, and he found himself in a very difficult situation. Singapore had no natural resources and no national identity. Some groups were fighting in Singapore and the living conditions were horrible. It was his job to fix this. First, he had to fix the violence in Singapore. He done this by banning individual freedoms, free speech and other rights. Geopolitical opponents really punished drug dealers and other criminals. Despite this seeming harsh, it actually worked, and the violence in Singapore stopped. They implemented other harsh laws, publicly caning people for chewing gum or graffitiing. If you spoke out against the government, you would be sued until your business collapsed and bankrupt. After repressing other groups in Singapore like Communist Chinese, Malaysians who wanted to reunite with Malaysia, he moved on to fixing Singapore's economy after stabilising his regime. Fix the housing crisis in Singapore by making Singaporeans save 25% of their paycheck for housing, which they could buy at low rates because of his laws. To fix the economic crisis in Singapore, neighbours tried to stop them from trading, and there were a lack of jobs because of a lack of natural resources. The only way he could fix this was through foreign trade. He exempt foreign companies from taxes for the first 10 years in Singapore and kept the tax rates low anyway, and foreign investors flocked into Singapore. This mixed with Singapore's great location led to a boom in Singapore's economy and led to many jobs being available. Kept increasing hyper-capitalist policies in Singapore, and now it's one of the best countries to do business in the world. Since the business in Singapore was so reliant on the government, he had to make sure there was no corruption in the government. He done this by raising government wages to some of the highest in the world, and he also made the sentence for corruption death. The money the government made was reinvested into infrastructure and education in the country, further increasing its productivity. Lee also started technical schools in Singapore and paid foreign companies to train Singaporean workers. A mix of strict punishment for criminals, a strong and not corrupt regime, and foreign investment to a high level made Singapore what it is today, and Kuan Lee was one of the main factors for its success. So if you're going to learn a lesson today, if you repress everyone, you might end up good like Singapore. This is how a tiny island became one of the richest countries in the world. I make videos like this all the time, so if you like this video, subscribe.